Hello, and welcome to the Armin Show podcast, Science, People, Creativity, Learning More, and Expanding through books and discussion. On this episode here, we have the author of this book, wonderful and informative, Language versus Reality, Why Language is Good for Lawyers and Bad for Scientists. The author, Professor Nick J. Enfield, joins us from University of Sydney. Nick, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
I'm very glad about this. Here's a biography of yours. You are Professor of Linguistics at the University of Sydney and Director of the Sydney Social Sciences and Humanities Advanced Research Centre and the Sydney Centre for Language Research, Head of the Research Excellence Initiative on the Crisis of Post-Truth Discourse, with research on language, culture, cognition, and social life based on long-term fieldwork in mainland Southeast Asia, especially Laos, with other books including Natural Causes of Language, Distributed Agency, and How We Talk, leading up to this book, Language versus Reality. You are professor in the category of Linguistics at University of Sydney. It is Monday here, Tuesday there. Tell me about your path to where you currently are in that department.
So the path is a long one, as I guess any professor will explain. It takes a long time to get to a certain point in academia, and for me it started with just being interested in the world and the diversity of cultures and languages around the world. So that led me to want to travel, and when I traveled, that led me to want to learn different languages. As a undergrad, I got a bit of a taste of linguistics, just kind of doing random arts subjects. And then I spent some time traveling. So by the time I'd kind of come back from seeing some of the world, I knew what I wanted to do. So I studied linguistics as a major and got into that much more seriously through research. And the kind of linguistics that I was taught in Australia is very much oriented to field work, so traveling to places where languages are spoken, particularly languages that haven't been well described before, so languages that aren't written down, languages that are spoken by small communities. And I did that. Laos is the area where I've really concentrated my work over the years, and that approach led me to really understand language in its social and cultural context. So not only just being interested in the technicalities of language, but also its kind of cultural and social context. And that's really what led to me focusing on a lot of the questions that I focus on. Obviously, it's been some time since I finished my PhD, more than 20 years. And through that time, I've benefited from a lot of incredible collaborations with people from different research areas. So not all linguists, rather anthropologists and psychologists and sociologists who've helped me to understand language in the way I do. So that is kind of the, I guess, disciplinary background. And it led me to do the work that I've done. And on the basis of that, I got a job here at the University of Sydney, and that's where I've been for the last 7 years or so.
That's cool. Now, one thing I always like to take into account, are there any key people that caused a fork in your path that led you to where you are when you think about your path to here? Is there any one or two individuals that are a big reason that you ended up in that direction?
Sure. There are my teachers, really, from early on. So I studied originally the Thai language with a professor called Tony Diller, who was really not only a really enthusiastic and expert teacher of that language, but also a linguist and someone who was interested in the kind of theoretical basis of what language is like, not just learning how to string sentences together, but, to go deeper. He sort of was important in getting me started. Then I guess when I was an undergrad, there were two professors of linguistics, one was Anna Wierzbicka and the other was Bob Dixon. And they had very different personalities, but both incredibly brilliant people and people who really emphasized the importance of meaning in language and the importance of understanding language in its context while being really serious about rigorous analysis of language. So both of those people really kind of taught me the tools of the trade and taught me a mindset about doing serious work on language. And then I guess two other people were really important. One is Nick Evans, who was my PhD supervisor at the University of Melbourne. He was also a student of those same two people I mentioned earlier, Anna Wierzbicka and Bob Dixon. He's an Australian language researcher and now Papuan languages. But the kind of philosophy of approaching language is something that I very much got from working with him. And then finally, after my PhD, I got a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute for Psycholinguistics in the Netherlands in the department of Steve Levinson, who was originally trained in archaeology and anthropology and then went into cognitive science and linguistics. And he was somebody really incredible to work with over those kind of formative years of my research years. And in fact, I spent 14 years in his group in the Netherlands before coming here. And, I think if I had to say one person was most important, it would have to be him in terms of, giving me the space and the support and the guidance and the mentorship to really do the kind of things that I do today.
That's cool. I always think about the key people in our existence that guide us in some direction or support us for an extended period of time.
Sure.
Now, before I get into some of the topics from the book, I would like to say I like the density of it, and I like how many of the things in the book spoke to me in the way I hear things, which is not so common in most books. So that was great. Very logical, connecting back with philosophers, their messages, how they connect with now, and with examples that apply. So I enjoyed that part. Now, the first topic I'd like to get into is, well, before I get into topics, why language is good for lawyers and bad for scientists. Why is it good for lawyers and bad for scientists? Why is that the topic of concern?
So the book really started out not really framed in that way. So the original idea of this book was that, I had a working title for the book, which was Language Destroyer and Creator. And I had this idea that I wanted to really explore was that, in certain ways, language really kind of strips away our experience and strips away and sort of alters and redirects the way we think about things. But on the other hand, it's this incredibly powerful creative resource for humans. And as I explored that when I was working on the book, I was also thinking about distinctions like the one that the author Julia Galef makes between what she calls the soldier mindset and the scout mindset. And so, just like her distinction between soldier and scout, my distinction between lawyers and scientists is really, it's a metaphor. I'm not really kind of trying to be mean to lawyers, but, the idea is that for lawyers in this metaphor, they are defending a position. And, the question of truth is, it's important in all sorts of ways, but it's essentially incidental to the immediate goals of trying to defend a position. So just like a soldier, you're fighting for a certain kind of cause. And your immediate concern is to defend that, to persuade other people of your position, to justify your position. And it turns out that language is well designed for those kinds of functions. It allows you to talk about things in ways that highlight certain things and background certain things, and it's a way of packaging what you want to say sort of persuasively. On the other hand, you've got, the scientist or the scout, as Julia Galef describes it, the one who simply wants the truth and has no investment in whether the truth turns out to be X or Y. Now, obviously, this is a kind of cartoon caricature because real scientists are very often highly invested in a certain outcome. So I'm not talking about real people. As I said, it's a metaphor. But on this metaphor, the idea is that if you really want to get at the truth, those same properties of language that make it good for persuasion make it bad or difficult for truth-seeking, because, if you are accessing truth through language, or if you're accessing information through language, it's always changing or redirecting your attention to the bit of reality that you're trying to understand. So it certainly doesn't mean you can't understand reality through language. We do all the time, but we need to be aware and sensitive to the ways in which that kind of view of reality is getting modulated by the language that we speak. So that's the sort of fundamental metaphor there. And what I talk about in the book is, on the one hand, those ways in which kind of language mangles the truth, and the other ways in which language kind of allows you to, persuade and create a shared reality, and in particular to coordinate with other people around ideas and reality, quite distinct from, the question of what's true or not true. It sort of more relates to what's useful from a social point of view.
I like to make the distinction. I have always noticed that slight difference of when it's language for informational purposes and truth-seeking, kind of like a library, versus language in a persuasive realm. They're not the same. They just don't look the same. And the persuasive one, I have never really gravitated towards, but I see its functionality in a way.
Well, can I just say briefly, the persuasive function of language, with language, it's interesting because we have ideas about language. We have sort of ideologies about language and beliefs about language. And we might say, for example, I like to treat language, as this objective structure, and I don't want to gravitate towards the persuasive kind of elements of it. But the truth is that we're using language all day, every day, and most of the time we're not reflecting on it. So even if we have a philosophy of, trying to be, scientific with our language, then we're not going to be very good at actually holding that sort of value or that principle up in most of our everyday life, because when we're interacting with our friends and family members and so on, we're not really trying to exchange facts about the world. What we're trying to do is to align with people and to persuade them of our position and influence them in various kinds of ways, which are, not necessarily exploitative, but we're doing them all the time. So those aspects of language, you can't really escape them.
Right. I like to mention that also. It's like looking at the level underneath, which you mentioned a few times in the book. That's a great quality. Sometimes something will be mentioned like, I am not thinking of that, but even mentioning that is almost underneath it might be a representation that one is thinking of that. So interesting. Now, there's a disconnect between the words we use and all the things out there and how matched up they are. Why is there this space, and do we have any tools to make it easier to speak directly what is happening or what we're feeling?
Well, talking about what is happening versus what we're feeling, I suppose they're different things. So they might be approached directly. They might be approached independently. But coming to your basic question, one of the things I pull apart in the book is the idea that there are these two steps away from reality for humans. So on the one hand, we are evolved creatures with this kind of perceptual apparatus. So if we assume that reality is this incredibly rich kind of set of phenomena that are out there. So, for example, electromagnetic waves at this incredible kind of array of wavelengths. Most of it we can't access, but it's there. We can design instruments to perceive those signals. That's the reality in that little domain, and our bodies only give us a very small slice of that reality. So there's something called visible light, which is this tiny slice of electromagnetic radiation, and human beings walking around don't see most of what's actually kind of in front of us. So that's one radical compression, if you like, of reality. So we only see what we sort of need to see for the most for survival, if you like. It's kind of evolved features of our access to reality is radically reduced. Then after that, you have this second kind of radical subtraction, and that's done through language. So you might take the domain of visible light, and in that domain you can see hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of distinctions, just noticeable differences in say, color. But no language has anything remotely approaching, a tiny fraction of 1% of those distinctions in the vocabulary for color terms. So if you are trying to exactly capture your experience of a color that you're looking at, it's going to be very hard for you to do that using words. I mean, it's essentially going to be impossible. So, I mean, it does depend a lot on what domain you're trying to describe. Are you talking about color? Are you talking about an event? Are you talking about some kind of mathematical equation? What thing we're trying to describe, will determine how easy or difficult it is to actually do that description. So with certain domains, it's not hard, and we have language that's well worked out for certain things. So maybe mathematical concepts or geometric concepts, if they're kind of abstract, we can communicate them very accurately using words. I don't know, something like a right angle, for example. A 90-degree angle, it's kind of, if you and I both understand the domain, then I can refer to that very easily. But if I'm trying to refer to some sort of shade of emotion I'm having, or some sort of shade of color that I'm seeing, or some subtle, way that a person is leaning in the interaction that they're having, I mean, these things are very hard to describe in any language. Having said that, some languages are better than others in describing certain kinds of things. And that's where we see languages being diverse in terms of what they're good for, in some sense. But the basic kind of answer to your question is that reality itself is radically reduced for practical purposes by us, and then it's reduced radically another step by the kind of very clunky, very broad brush kind of categories that language gives us.
Makes sense. The bandwidth is cut down. It's kind of like when we're communicating with the thumb on phones and we have very low ability to get everything through. Now, you mentioned diversity there. Languages, there's so many of them, but they have shared elements that have to be there for the purposes of language. We talk about the concept of constrained diversity, that they have to have features or predictable parts that match up between them. What are some of the features that have to exist between different languages, and where can the variety be?
Well, it's a big question because languages have a lot in them. So, if you ask, okay, what can a language consist of? What has to be in a language? Well, there's a long list of things that can be in a language. One obvious thing that has to be in a language is words. languages are all going to have thousands of words, and they're likely to have tens of thousands of words. And so all of those words are, if you look carefully at words, each one of these thousands of words, packs a world of information into it. And what information gets packed into a word will depend on the history and the culture of the people who speak that language in certain kind of obvious ways, right? So, you might have you might have words for things like bread and coffee, things that you consume every day and that you need to go and buy and coordinate around in various kinds of ways. All languages will have words for things that people are concerned with and somehow need to collaborate around in everyday life. And that's a basic fact about language. And of course, you might say, okay, well, cultures are radically different, so therefore, languages can be radically different without any kind of limit. And that's putting it a little bit too strongly, because there are a lot of ways in which human life is kind of the same wherever you go, right? So obviously there are these really important differences. Cultures are organized differently. People live in different climates. They eat different kinds of foods and have different, kinship systems and lots of differences for sure. But at the same time, there's a lot of similarities. So we all have human bodies. We all have gravity. We're living on the same planet. There's a lot of the causal relations that surround us are the same. So, you can look into the way that languages are organized in their words, what kinds of things they refer to. So one of the examples I talk about in the book is the ways in which people can move around. So if you just look at people walking, running, hopping, skipping, there's all sorts of ways that you can kind of go down the street. And I talk about a study by psychologist Barbara Molt and colleagues who look at, if you put a person on a treadmill and the treadmill is just going slowly and, they're just in English, we would say they're walking. And if you just slowly crank up the speed of the treadmill, then at a certain moment, that person will, what we say in English, to be able to break into a run. I mean, they're going to they can no longer walk, it's going too fast, so they will start to run. And that means that you make a whole set of changes in your body. The way you move your legs is different, the way you move your body is different. It's not just one small change. It's a whole mode of bodily motion change occurs. And that doesn't have to do with any individual culture. That's something in the human body. So you can, what those researchers showed was that you can have a lot of differences in language, like whether you have a word for hopping or skipping or strolling, these more sort of specific, detailed words for ways of getting around. Sure, some languages won't have those exact same words, but if a language has more than one word for how you get around on foot, it will distinguish first between walking and running. So that's one kind of simple example of constrained diversity that, you can elaborate a certain area of meaning in your language, but and there you'll see diversity across languages in how those elaborations take place, but there'll be some shared principles. So you see that in things like words for parts of the body. You see it in words for different colors. So there are sort of, for example, an order in which a language would add words for colors. You're not going to have a language that just has 10 words for different shades of blue and then no other color words. You will sort of evenly work your way through the color space, dividing it in these certain kinds of ways. And some languages only have a couple of terms for abstract colors, like kind of warm colors and cool colors. And then, other languages will start to split that space up. So the order in which a language will kind of break up that area of experience, for example, in color, through the history of that language, will reflect this kind of the constraints on the diversity of human languages. And a lot of what linguistics does as a science is tries to pin down what are the constraints on the diversity of human language. And it's really, that's the kind of crucial question. We see that languages are diverse. Obviously, we can't speak all the languages in the world. They're very different from each other, and most of us only speak, 2 or 3 languages. But clearly there are constraints on that, and that's what we're really trying to kind of nut out.
I thought about that. I recently talked with another linguist as well, and I was thinking about what are the baseline items. I'm sort of like a deconstructionist, so I like to break things down to the base and then work from there, kind of like you just described. If there was colors, you would start from the base of a few colors that are the variety of ones that are common, and then you would go to shades and whatnot. Same with language. Now, we have words we use when we're communicating with others, and are we able to, using our words, affect others as far as what they would remember from an occasion or how they would respond to something? Can we alter their memory or what they remember of what happened just with the words that we put out into the air?
Yeah, you can. And we don't do that in an intentional way most of the time. It's not the kind of thing that you can kind of teach, but you can certainly discover that there are these kind of effects of words on memory and on performance. So in the book, I talk about some examples of things like priming effects and overshadowing effects. So, for example, if you are looking at a picture, there are these experiments in the psychology of language where people get shown a photograph of an object or a painting of an object, and you have to name that thing. So people will study, how do we get from an image going into our eyes to selecting the word and then sending the instruction to our mouth to pronounce the word, and there's all sorts of stuff has to happen, and people study that. So one thing you do in that line of work is you just show people an image and get them to say what they see. So it might be a picture of a guitar, and they see it and they say the word guitar. Now, if you, just before you show someone the image of the guitar, if you show them something else that is related to it in some way, so it might be shaped like a guitar, it might be like a tennis racket, or it might be related to a guitar in some way, in what kind of a thing it is. So it might be a musical instrument. In various ways like that, you can prime the person, which means that you can actually bring to light in their mind, sort of bring forward in their mind just a little bit, the related concepts through what they see previously. And then that means that when they see the guitar picture, then they're quicker at accessing that word. And we say that they're primed for it. So there's a kind of this is a kind of positive interference, if you like. It's not interfering. It's not slowing people down. It's actually sort of speeding them up in certain kinds of ways. But there's a downside to those types of effects, and that is that, if you prime people in those ways, then they jump more readily to the conclusion that, what they see is a guitar, and they're less likely to notice errors or sort of unusual features of what they're seeing, because they've been primed to gravitate towards the thing that they were expecting. So that, one of the effects of that is that when people hear descriptions of things, what they tend to do, it's a kind of a categorization that they're hearing. And categorization is fundamentally an act of throwing away information. So let me explain what I mean. If you show me like 10 different chairs from a furniture catalog or something like that, they're all chairs. I can see they're all chairs. I give them all that same label, chairs. But if you look at them, obviously you quickly see some really significant differences. You know, some of them have 4 legs, and some of them maybe have like a central kind of support thing underneath, and some have got wheels, and some have arms on the side, some don't. They're different colors, they're different material. Suddenly all this information is visible to you. You realize, but when you say, well, I bought 10 chairs today, the labeling of them using that single category in a kind of very obvious way is throwing away all that distinguishing information. And that's fine, because it's clearly, not relevant. If I'm just telling you I bought 10 chairs, for the meeting or something, it's not really important. All the details, the differences between those chairs are not important. So that's a completely tolerable kind of feature of language. It throws away information, and that doesn't really create problems a lot of the time. But occasionally it does create problems, and those have been shown experimentally in interesting ways. So one example that I talk about in the book is this verbal overshadowing effect, where describing an event in a certain way affects the way that you remember it. So I'm talking about your own description of that event, or the description that someone else gives you when, we're talking about that event immediately after. So an example of this would be in a study of eyewitness memory. People were shown video recordings of a robbery, and, you sit there and you see this robbery, and there's a perpetrator who carries out the robbery, and you see their face, and, you see all these details. And then afterwards, some of the people in the experiment were asked to describe the person's face as accurately as they could. And other people in the experiment were not asked to do this, so they didn't kind of linguistically describe the person's face. And then later on, sometime later, they showed the people from the experiment a bunch of faces, just like you would get in a kind of lineup, tell me, do you see the perpetrator's face among these faces? And it turned out that the people who had tried to describe the face linguistically were actually worse at remembering or at picking out the face from the lineup than the people who never used language to describe the face. And the idea there is that presumably through this kind of categorization function of language that kind of throws out information, that is efficient in a certain way. You get rid of information, you don't need to hold on to it. But the collateral effect of that is that in those small set of occasions where you might really need to hold on to the detailed information, you can't recover it. It's kind of gone through this bottleneck, if you like. So that would be one of the sorts of effects of language, of words in this case, on your memory. And that, has really significant effects in examples like this one, where you're talking about eyewitness identification of a perpetrator. So you certainly don't want to be on the receiving end of a, misremembered face. You find yourself in jail for a crime you didn't commit. And those are obviously rare in comparison to the kind of general day-to-day things that we do with language, but, they're there, and they can, you can see how the distorting effects of language can have significant effects in examples like that.
That's an interesting one. It can affect on our own self. It's like compressing the data, and sometimes it changes how we remember it just from having to think of it. It's almost like sports players who, until they get to moving and making like a tennis racket move in autopilot, it's a struggle until it gets to their subconscious, and now it stays there and it's a fluid motion. If they think about it, no, it's less efficient actually in those cases. Now, one thing that I have thought about various times, and I think I've asked about it once, but I never really got an answer. Different languages. If someone speaks Chinese or someone speaks Turkish or whatever it might be, does it alter anything about their personality, their path in life, their risk-taking, any of those features as connected with their language? Will it affect their behavior?
Well, I think it will, and I think most people have that same feeling. People who speak different languages will often report, yeah, I feel different when I'm speaking that language, or I think different when I'm speaking that language. You know, that I have two sort of personalities. One is when I'm speaking language X, and the other is when I'm speaking language Y. So there's a strong kind of intuition that people have about that question. But, of course, we want to know, like, what does that really mean? There's a response to that kind of view, that intuition, which says, no, you don't really think differently, you know, when you're speaking another language. You know, we're all capable of walking around and, you know, doing math or kind of reasoning about the causal nature of the world and things like this. So there's a certain amount of kind of scientific skepticism about this idea that language could affect your way of thinking. But, you know, I think it certainly can. The important thing is just to break down what that question is actually about. Now, the source of that idea, which is often referred to as linguistic relativity, goes back a long way. I mean, as I said, it's an intuition that a lot of people have, but oftentimes people will cite linguists or people working on language going back to a German tradition, but most notably people like Franz Boas and Edward Sapir in early 20th century American anthropology, people working with Native American languages, so languages that are very different in interesting ways from European languages, and those researchers were really struck by these interesting differences, and they said, well, you know, these different languages kind of alert us to different ways of seeing the world and framing the way that the world is. And this was made most famous by Benjamin Lee Whorf, who was a kind of a later inherited that tradition and kind of made it famous. And he was also a student of North American languages and wrote extensively about the idea that I just mentioned. But he's very often cited for this discussion that he has in one of his early papers. So these are from the 1930s. It's going back quite a way now. And he was a fire insurance salesman, or, you know, fire insurance agent. And one of the things that he did was deal with people's fire claims. They said, oh, you know, we had a fire in our factory or whatever, and, you know, can you come and evaluate the cause of the fire and see if we are entitled to our insurance payout? And he writes about this and says, yeah, look, if you look at the way people behave in these settings, the behavior that led to the fire breaking out, I think that it is somehow related to the way that they talk about these situations. So he lists these examples. So says, for example, there are some drums that they keep fuel in, and the fuel drums have been emptied, and so they're referred to as empty drums. But actually they're full of these fumes that can explode. And so people, because the label on the drums is empty, this word leads them to reason in ways that are dangerous, and they behave as if they were really kind of had no danger there, and they throw cigarette butts around or whatever, and lo and behold, there's an explosion. Or another example, he talks about a substance called spun limestone, which is actually inflammable, but because it's referred to as a kind of stone, people think, oh, it's not flammable. So his argument was that the words that we use for things, people will take those words at face value, and they will act in accordance with those words being somehow reflective of the reality that they're trying to kind of navigate in life. And I think, these are controversial arguments. They're simply anecdotes from him, and a lot of scientists have said, well, we need to test these, and they have been tested in interesting ways. I cite numerous studies by the cognitive scientist Lera Boroditsky, who's been studying these things for years, and showing interesting ways in which there are these effects of language on thought and behavior. The thing that I want to kind of emphasize that I think is not appreciated that much about what Worf was actually talking about in that early work is that it's not so much that the words of our language make us think in certain ways. I think, that's part of it. It's that they make us not think in certain ways. So I just was talking earlier about how, when you categorize things, you discard information. And part of that is through categorization, but also part of it is through just drawing your attention to some part of a scene, and then this automatically kind of makes you disattend all the other possible parts of the scene. So you have a description of the reality, which is, spun limestone or whatever, and it makes you kind of switch off your thinking about what else could be going on in this situation. And then that leads you to act in a certain kind of way. So that's, I think, a key part of it. And then the final thing I think that's really interesting about Worf's examples is that the examples come from situations in which people who started these fires accidentally, he doesn't have evidence, direct evidence about, their thought processes as they carried out the behavior. His evidence comes from the people's justifications for their behavior that were offered after the fact. And, this comes back to something that we were talking about earlier, that why language is good for lawyers as opposed to scientists. Well, this is a good case of that, right? Because people are actually trying to formulate a defense of how they acted. And they formulate that in a certain way using the linguistic resources that are available to them. So, of course, we'll never know if those thought processes actually occurred in real time, but we do know that people use those formulations as defenses of their behavior. And that brings it back to what I've tried to emphasize is the key factor with language is not so much as a tool for thought, but rather a tool for social coordination, a tool for influencing how others see things, a tool for defending yourself, all of those things, which is really a social tool primarily as opposed to a purely cognitive tool.
That just made me think of like a press reporter that takes things and filters them through to a certain way of responding, and it may have some of the information left out, but it's categorized. And sometimes people who are really, it makes you feel like they are built to be a press reporter. It's really honed down where you think that they're not even thinking it through. It's just automatically filtered to a certain category. Now, to do that, one thing is cognitive effort. I always think about the prefrontal cortex and using effort to communicate. Is there a benefit to putting a lot of effort in communication, and can you get more across by being, let's say, a very effort-based communicator? Can you be like doing double the work of the average person if you put in a lot of effort on a regular basis to maybe vocabulary or get more points across? Or is it better to go down to like a lowest common denominator way of communicating that's the simplest?
I think the basic principle is neither of those. The basic principle is optimal effort and optimizing the right amount of effort for what it is that you want to convey. So, it's not going to work just to go to more effort. And it's not going to work just to minimize, just to go to the least possible effort, because the natural end point of that is that you just go away, you do nothing, you just go to sleep or, disappear or something that would minimize your effort. And of course, I mean, in some absolute sense, that's what it would do. And we don't want that. So, every question around how much effort we go to, is mediated by the other question, which is what are we trying to achieve? So more, you've got this target of influencing the other person in some way. So, either you're trying to influence them in some manipulative sense, you want them to pass you something that's close to them, you're cooking in the kitchen, can you pass me that knife? You want to go to just enough effort that you can achieve the result that you're going for, right? So let's say, we're in the kitchen, we're cooking, and I need a particular knife and it's right next to you and I'm on the opposite side of the kitchen. Well, I could go to more and more and more effort to describe, can you pass me the black-handled knife, and I can describe the characteristic features of the knife, how many little chips it has on it and how much it costs and what shop we bought it from and all these things. I could go to just infinite effort, but it would backfire because you would be like, why is he going into all this extra information about the knife? I already know which knife he means, and so forth. So that, that's a really important principle with language, is that the minute you go to too much effort, that itself has added implications. If you go into unnecessary detail, people will read into that. Like, what's he trying to do? Is he trying to annoy me, or is he trying to send me a special signal? These are really interesting principles around communication, and what they show is that the default is minimal effort for a goal that you have. And so I think it's important to think about that not really as minimal effort, but as optimal effort, because you're optimizing, the payoff of whatever goal it is that you're trying to kind of reach, on the one hand, and the cost of articulating the message. That's one kind of cost, but then there are also the potential kind of social costs of things like, this person thinks I'm a jerk, or, I'm wasting this person's time, or, whatever other kind of side effects there might be. So the point about language usage is that, as some sociologists of language have said, there's no time out from, the other person's interpretation of how you're using language. You select words for certain purposes, but they will always judge you for that word selection if it is somehow inappropriate or different or unexpected or what have you.
That makes sense. That one was more from a personal end, that question for me, because I always went in the high effort direction at times, and I got some of the response that you're describing because there's that layer underneath as well. That's a good one. There's a few things in mind as I was reading the book. I was thinking, wait a minute, there's relation to my own experiences. Now, in the later portion of the book, it gets more into influence and how it can impact others, and it starts to make language look like what a powerful thing that we have, but only or mostly if we use certain elements of it or set it up in a certain way. One of those is kind of like around this image, the framing you put around it. When you frame a point, is that stronger than even the details of the point, the way that you set up the description? Can that be more impactful than the actual persuasive elements you're trying to present?
Yeah, I think it is highly impactful, but I think more importantly, it's actually quite hard to distinguish between the framing and the thing that you're trying to frame. And the reason is because you can never not frame things. So let me try to be a little bit more concrete. If you just take any kind of, you go to the art gallery and you look at some paintings on the wall, you see that, most paintings have some kind of title, right? So you'll see, for example, I don't know, Van Gogh painting that has a kind of wheat field and there's a path in the middle of it, and there's a, sky in the background, and there's some ravens there. Now, I could describe that painting in a bunch of ways, okay? And not just describe it, like give it a title. I could say, okay, here's my painting. It's called Wheat Field with Crows. Or here's my painting. It's called, The Trail. Or here's my painting. It's called Summer Sky. It'll give you any sort of title. And each of those titles is a kind of framing. It's a kind of claim as an instruction to the viewer. What are you seeing? What am I trying to get you to look at here? It's the same painting, but, when you give three different titles to it, then what that does is it injects the intentions of the person who came up with that title or that description, and creates an idea in your mind that is a skewed version of what you see in a very obvious way. If you've told this is a picture of a wheat field with crows, then the path and the sky are kind of, okay, they're incidental, or they just happen to be there too. And it will affect, what you remember about it and how you reason about it. Now, that might seem kind of trivial when you're talking about a painting on the wall, but let me just start with that because I think it nicely illustrates the idea of framing. It's sort of a way of telling you, here's what I want you to look at because this is what I created. That's what the artist is sort of saying. Okay, here's what I want you to, here's how I want you to think about what you're looking at. That's fundamentally what framing is. And the interesting thing in the art gallery example is that the titles are language. Art is this amazing thing that isn't language. You're just looking at, visual stuff. And, but it's interesting that it is so often kind of regulated by language through the titles, the words that people give to these artworks. And there's, very often just a few words or one word. Of course, occasionally you have untitled, but that's sort of more the exception. Now, if you go into other kinds of contexts, you see, actually, this does make a kind of difference. So one example, I think I mentioned in passing in the book, is about the credit card lobby in, I guess, the 70s and 80s when credit cards were taking off. So there was a certain point where, everybody used cash and that's all we had. And then they invented the credit card and wanted to introduce it to public use. And one of the reasons for that, of course, is that the credit card companies make money through a little surcharge, right? So, you pay for something and then you have to pay this little 1% or whatever it is, 1.5% or something for the convenience. And they found that this was obviously an interesting little problem, was how do you get people to use the credit card even though they have to pay this little extra cost? Well, there's kind of two ways, probably infinite ways you could frame this, but two ways you could frame it are, here's the price for the thing that you want to buy. And if you want to pay with credit card, well, you have to pay this little bit extra. And so we'll call that a credit card surcharge. And that's how we're framing it. The alternative is we say, no, here's the price. You get this price when you pay by credit card. And if you pay cash, you get a little discount. So we'll call that a cash discount, right? So they're the same two amounts, and they're just framed in these really different ways, right? And, it turns out there's this whole sort of field of research in behavioral economics, people like Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, nudge theory and all of that, show that framing makes you reason and come to different decisions in different ways. And this comes precisely back to what you asked about Benjamin Lee Whorf, although he didn't have the language or the kind of the context for talking about how these effects might work. But in the credit card surcharge case and similar ones that people studied experimentally, you can, through these framing effects, you can nudge people's decision-making in really quite concrete ways. And when you do that at scale, such as, trying to sell credit cards uptake to millions of people in the States or anywhere in the world, it makes a massive difference. You can, make more and more billions from that. And that's why the credit card lobby were really keen to see the framing look like that. So you see these framing effects in marketing, you see these framing effects in any sort of field of influence, which includes the news. And that's, I think where it is more and more important for us to appreciate in examples like the art gallery case and the credit card surcharge case, look how our thinking is being directed in these ways just by word choice. And you would think, okay, we all understand the phenomenon. With the credit card thing, the phenomenon is clear. The phenomenon is, you've got two ways to pay. One's credit card, one is cash. One way you pay a tiny bit more, the other you pay a tiny bit less. The reality seems like clear, but that's not how it really works in life. We go by the framing so much more. We don't ignore the framing. The framing ends up being quite influential, and it's everywhere. So when you're looking at news, even when you're listening to what your friend is saying to you at a barbecue or something, it's being framed, and you just have there is no default alternative. There's no non-framed alternative. Every way of saying something, every way of describing one situation is choosing a certain way of framing it. And so there's no kind of correct framing. You might just argue that there is a better or worse framing for something. So with the credit card case, the credit card company executive will say, oh no, cash discount is the better framing. And the reason is because that's the one that people will be more likely to opt for credit card because they're more willing to forego a discount than they are to incur a cost. But obviously, the credit card executive is preferring that framing because it's in his or her interest. So that's really the bottom line with framing is that, you can't escape it. It's always there. A lot of the time, it really doesn't matter what the framing is. But it's always betraying some kind of underlying reason, why a person has chosen the words they've chosen or chosen the framing that they've chosen. It's because of how they're trying to portray the world, how they're trying to influence your thinking. And I don't mean this in a kind of cynical way. When we're with our friends, when we're with our allies, we want to be influenced in the way that they want to influence us. That's what social coordination is all about. It's just that we need to be aware of the fact that it is still nevertheless a form of influence on us. And so, the proper thing to do is to be aware of when and how framing's happening, and be able to kind of break frame to get out of the framing that we're in and think about alternative ways of putting things, and particularly with news and kind of informational discourse that we're surrounded by now. That's a very important principle.
I like the example that you gave about that, one of them in the book, with the word treaty, and how that represents a negotiation between countries in a way that sounds great, but it could be enforced in a very aggressive manner. And it's like it's a well-chosen frame for the creating country in a way. Now, on a related note, on a separate category, because I like philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, I've spoken about him many times, and sometimes I think that we as people are connections to people in the past, so like philosophers down the line to now versus evolutionary biologists. There are like people carrying the baton from the past. He had a concept called the ruler, and you described it in the book, and it connects with the second level of meaning you've mentioned a few times here. Do people, in relation to this, do people listen to the second level of meaning more than even the first level of direct conversation that we have?
Yeah, I do think that what you call in the second level of meaning is often the most important one. So, I mean, let me just describe what the ruler is. So there's a little, I mean, Wittgenstein is funny to read, from modern standards because, they're just these little paragraphs or sometimes just little sentences that are kind of working through ideas in kind of fashion that you would not really read these days. People don't really write like that. But still, it's incredibly influential and in certain ways kind of really accessible. And this one paragraph about the ruler, he's pointing out that, a ruler is a way of measuring something. So you can pull out your ruler and you can test, how long is this thing, like a table. I'm going to take the ruler and check how long the table is. And he says, yeah, look, that's fine, but you can invert that relationship between the thing measuring and the thing being measured. So you can say, for example, well, I know how long this table is, but I'm not sure if this ruler is reliable. So I'm going to take the ruler and check it against the table, and we'll see, if we want to calibrate the ruler or something like that, we can calibrate it against something that we know the properties of. And this was a metaphor that he mentions. You can see in action with a student in a classroom. So, if you just have two people and I ask you, I don't know, what's the capital of Australia, and you say Canberra, that would be correct. But it all depends on who's asking whom, right? So, if a pupil is asking a teacher, then the teacher is the one who has the authority over information, and the teacher says Canberra, and the pupil is now updated and gets new information. So that word, gives you a measure of the world. I now know what is the capital city of Australia. But if it goes the other way around, that the teacher asks the pupil, then they're not trying to extract information. The teacher knows the answer to the question. What they're doing is trying to test the knowledge of the student. So they're trying to actually test how good, as a measuring rule, is this person. So any time you use language, you're simultaneously getting information on these two levels. One is that you're somehow getting their, if you look at the content of the words that they speak, then, you're getting some claim about how the world is, and that's some claim, some measure about the world. And at the same time, you're getting information about the person who's talking to you. So, and that in itself, also has many levels to it. So you're getting information of all sorts of kinds. Like you're getting information about, if you can't see them, you might not know, is it a man or a woman? And you should be able to hear that in their voice. You might not know, are they sort of tired or full of energy? You'll get that from their voice, quite independent of what it is that they're saying. So you'll know whether they're a native speaker or not. You'll know, maybe which part of the world they're from, all the rest of it. people are constantly giving off this information about themselves through the way they talk. And this idea of Wittgenstein's ruler is that applies also to their choices of words. So the ways in which people describe the world, the things that people say, will tell you oftentimes as much about the person as they do about the piece of the world being described. So there's a lot of this in media discourse. And you look, for example, at discussion of, in the US, I guess 2020, after the George Floyd killing, there was a lot of unrest in the streets, in the cities. And if you look at the media, you'll see some media outlets will use the word riot for those incidents, and others will use the word protest for those incidents. And, we can sort of see, or we might already know independently what those events were like, what things happened. People marched, and sometimes there was property damage and fighting and so forth. So we might have some sense of what really happened in the world. But if you describe it as rioting and I describe it as protesting, then that doesn't really update us about what happened in the world. What it does is updates us about who we are and about how we stand in relation to that piece of reality that we're describing. So that's Wittgenstein's ruler, and the argument there is that sometimes it might not matter to me whether that was a riot or a protest, or maybe it was both, or maybe there's no objective way of determining that it was a riot versus a protest. What's important is that I want to show you how I stand in relation to that. So I'm going to call it a riot, or I'm going to call it a protest, depending on who I am and what I want to be to you. So it's a really important principle because it shows that a lot of the time language is very flexible, very general, and there really isn't an objective way to pin down what's correct. It goes back to a number of the things that we've been saying already, and that is that, you choose your words partly based on reality, but also to a large extent based on how you want to influence that other person. But perhaps to be more accurate, it's in what way do you want to coordinate with that person? Are you trying to align with them? Are they your kind of ally? Or are you trying to convince them of something? Or, these are the purposes that we use language for. And if you think about that as the central purpose of language, then these framing effects begin to make more sense. Because if you view them as, if you view language as a kind of truth-seeking technology, well, those framing effects are not very good. They're getting in the way. They're giving you a sort of skewed view, however you look at it. But if you view language instead as a device for coordination, as a device for influence, as a device for justification, then framing effects make complete sense.
That's a great point. The space we put it in. How connected is framing with when we make a story of something? Because it's sort of like a frame, but a story has many compelling features. And Kobe Bryant, before he disappeared, he talked about the importance of storytelling a lot. And it is sort of a frame. What's the difference, and why is story so strong as an impactor to others, whereas just mentioning a couple of details for what they should do is not as impactful?
Well, storytelling is another level, sort of in structural terms, than just kind of word choice. So, if I talk about credit card surcharge versus cash discount, you might say, well, there's a whole, the frame, those two frames invoke a kind of narrative, so the narrative would be you go to a place, you get a service or a good, you pay some money. There's a kind of narrative underneath that in some interesting sense, and narratives everywhere you look. But there's a higher level of language organization, if you like, that I mean when I'm talking about storytelling. So there's quite a large section of this book is about storytelling and how it works and what it's good for. And what I mean when I talk about storytelling is not just, choosing one word as opposed to another, or choosing one kind of grammatical construction over another. It's about something that's structured at a higher level. So typically, if you look at, a good Hollywood movie, or not really, actually, it doesn't really have to do with quality. It's just most frequently, you look at any kind of major commercial movie, it's going to invariably have these features. There's going to be a strong individual character who you can take their perspective in the story. They've got a very clear desire that they're pursuing in the story. They've got needs, some kind of hole that they need to fill, and some goal that they need to attain that's very concrete in the course of the film or the novel, as the case may be. And you track that through time, through the course of the movie, and you get completely transported by it. And this is sort of one of the obvious kind of powers of storytelling in that sense of, movies and novels and things like that, is it's not just a word directing your attention one way or another. You go to a whole level of kind of influence that you get transported, as they say. There's this phenomenon of narrative transportation, which means that, all your attention gets zoomed in onto this story. You forget about what's the weather like outside. You forget about what else is going on in the house or whatever. You go to a movie theater and you don't even know what country you're in. You're just in the world of the film, right? And any kind of reasonably competent storytelling will have that effect. It will draw you in, and particularly if it's really funny or if it's really emotional, it's going to have these effects on your biology. It's going to get you to release, all of your kind of bodily chemicals that help to make you pay closer attention and so forth, and really track your attention through this story and hang out for the end, and see how does this story get resolved and how does the main character kind of transform themselves. And even though you know pretty clearly what's going to happen in the end of the film, you're still, really hanging out to see how it plays out. So those are kind of high-level effects of language. And obviously with films, it's very visual, and oftentimes a lot of the storytelling is done visually, but fundamentally it all boils down to the linguistic structuring of the story, how we talk about things that happen. And if you trace back, so obviously movies are a very recent phenomenon in humanity. And prior to that, for most of the history of our species, storytelling has been more heavily supported by language. Obviously, we have gesture and we have performance and we have dance, and those have always been around. And through time into the past, you've had this heavy reliance on particular kind of performative ways of using language to transport people and to engage them in the ways that I've just been saying, these quite powerful ways. Now, what's important to me about narrative is not only the demonstration of the power of language, but, on the individual, but on the functions of those stories. Like, why do we have them? And what are we doing when we're telling stories and consuming stories? And what you see is that influence is really kind of at the heart of it, or perhaps I should say coordination, social coordination is really at the heart of it. Because when you see a movie or when you hear a really engaging story, you don't only have an individual experience. You learn something about the values of the people involved. You inherit some of that, particularly if you identify as a person within that culture. You might learn something, even something practical about how you should behave in the world. So in the book, I talk about stories that get told across the generations, for example. So, in family life, it's very often the case that parents will tell stories to their kids about the parents' own days as a young person, that stupid things they did or amazing things that happened to them, or, life lessons, basically. And you tell these stories not just to amuse your kids, but to give them life lessons and to give them some tools for reasoning for their own benefit. This is the motivation behind telling stories to your kids, is you want them to learn from your errors, typically. And so that's something we see in family life, but it's also something that we see culturally. So also in the book, I talk about myths from different parts of the world where tsunamis have periodically hit the coast, or other kinds of major flood events. So over the history of the world, sea levels have changed radically, and people have experienced, really unbelievably disruptive events, like the water flooding into the what's now the Mediterranean, or sections of Australia that I talk about in the book, or tsunamis hitting. If you go to those places, you find that people have mythological tales about these terrifying scenarios of floods coming onto the land, that serve partly as kind of symbols of the culture and the background of the people in a sort of mythology, but they also teach you practical lessons. So in the tsunami case, I give the example of the Japanese folk tale where, this old man is on the hill and sees a tsunami approaching, and goes and sets fire to his house up on the hill, and all the villagers come running up to help to put the fire out in his house, and that's the way that he gets them to go up to higher land, and then when the tsunami hits, they're safe because they're up on the hill. So, the examples like that are ones where, either at a family level or at a kind of community level, you can use stories to transmit what might be seen as practical information, but also just generally, information that instills cultural values. So again, going back to the Hollywood films, often one of the things that we talk about in relation to movies is, what are the values being taught here, and do we agree with them or do we not agree with them? And fundamentally, there's an assumption that stories will instill certain values, whether they're designed to do that or not. And they do that precisely because they have this function of, of being made out of language fundamentally, and being good for lawyers in the sense that, you engage people's attention, you engage their emotions, and you try to point them in a certain direction. And that's exactly why you get taught in public speaking and public communication that, stories are everything. If you can tell a story to your audience, you get them on side and you get them, engaged and all of that. And these are some of the reasons why.
As a compelling force, it's like a targeting force that directs people in a certain direction or to a certain item, and it's hard to avoid. Once it's compelling, you're transported there and it's out of your hands. The last topic I wanted to cover was that it kind of relates with what you have said about coordination between people. We communicate as people. How does this, if there's a disconnect in communication, how does that tell us about something we don't understand yet? Whenever we have, it's like a glitch between people, can that be informative?
Yeah, it certainly can be informative. It's an interesting question because, disconnects between people can be there anytime, and we're not always aware of them. So we become aware of them in different ways. So, one way in which we can become aware of a disconnect when we're using language is through, overt signals. So people will say, huh, what's that? Or they will overtly kind of ask us to explain what we're saying or to repeat what we've said because there's some breakdown in communication. And that's happening all the time. This is something I've worked on and written about elsewhere, that, those kind of disconnections are just constant. They're part of using language, and the cooperative frame in which we use language allows us to kind of deal with that. So even our closest friends and allies won't always hear or understand the words we use, and we'll have to deal with them in the flow of an interaction. There might be a more subtle kind of level on which there's a disconnect, and that is more like, I'm not feeling this person. I'm not it's not clicking. I'm not really aligning with them. And that's more subtle, but if you look closely, I think that's where you'll start to see clues in the language, and it has to do with these practices around alignment. So I've been talking just now about storytelling, and one of the features of storytelling is that I'm not talking about Hollywood movies now. I'm talking about, when we're just in conversation and I'm telling you about some experience I had on the weekend, or I'm telling you about, something that my friend did. And typically you as a listener will be listening and kind of nodding along and giving me feedback. And, it's a highly structured kind of process where one person will be giving a narrative in the middle of a conversation, the other will be giving them feedback, and just very small signals like, yep, oh, wow, little signals like that indicate that they're understanding what's being said and kind of processing it and kind of correctly understanding who's being spoken about and what, but also that they are agreeing with the framing of what's being said. So they're kind of like, what a jerk, or, oh, wow, that's really surprising, or whatever it is the person's trying to say. Typically, we're trying to get the other one to align with us. So that's the kind of lawyer's goal, right? We're going to try to get the listener to sort of take our side. And oftentimes when we're talking to people, well, that's what we're trying to do. And if they're not doing that, you get these signals that, okay, they're not really taking the cues that I'm giving them, or they're not really, coming in where I'm expecting, or it's giving me the kinds of responses that I'm expecting. So they're not they're not asking you to explain or anything like that. It's not like the conversation is breaking down in some obvious way, but you're just not getting the alignment that you're kind of hoping for, and the affiliation that you're hoping for. So those are more subtle kind of ways in which communication can kind of break down. But then there's the third possibility, which is that you have some completely different understanding of what I'm talking about, and I don't detect it at all. And I think this is always, this is like the iceberg. I've been talking before about the tip of the iceberg. The iceberg is that, language, as we started talking about today, language is this very stripped back kind of description of what's really there. And now I'm trying to talk to you about my experience, for example, and get you to understand it. I'm just giving you the barest, most abstract kind of cues with my words to get you to know what I mean. And, I don't know how you're going to fill in all those blanks. You may end up having a really different understanding of what I'm describing, but I would never know, because I don't get into your head. I don't get to know, exactly what you're seeing. So unless you're somehow giving off some evidence, either explicitly or implicitly, then, at the end of the day, we just walk off and, we had a nice conversation, but actually we each understood something completely different about what happened. And, I think that's the case more often than not. But at the same time, it really doesn't matter, because we get through life, and I think we have a good enough understanding of each other and a good enough, this comes back to this point we've been making about, optimization. If our use of language is good enough for the purpose, and the purpose is, collaborating with others, aligning with them, maintaining our relations with them, and so on, then, it's fine for us to have different kind of details around how we understand things to be based on the skeletal descriptions that language kind of allows us.
I have to say, I do like the level of depth that is provided, because I think about such items as this in layers too. So when you describe it, it's always left out. It's often left out in public discourse. So when I see it, I'm like, oh, this is great. It's nice to have an extra layer of depth in discussion that is not often there. On that one, I would want to say, very informative. And for me, it's funny how a lot of linguistic material became quite personal as I was reading the book. I was like, oh, wait a minute, that. So that's wonderful. I would like to thank you for having joined on this episode and describing a variety of topics from this wonderful book, Language versus Reality. Professor Nick Enfield, thank you for joining the show.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
It was a wonderful pleasure on my end as well, and we are out.